So this video will take you through Ouyang Yu's poem New Accents, which is another one of the poems set for study for English Standard Module A, Language, Culture and Identity. So looking at the context of this poem, so Ouyang Yu is considered to be one of the 10 most influential Chinese poets, and he's most likely one of the most academically studied Asian Australian fiction writers of his generation. So he is considered to be quite a significant and important writer. Leaving China in the late 1980s to pursue his studies in English, Yu felt like he had been forcibly pushed back to his Chinese ethnicity. And this is a concept in terms of perhaps the frustration and prejudice that he experienced due to his pronunciation and his use of the English language. That sort of concept is presented within this poem, New Accents. In an interview, Yu states that living in Australia is like living after death, in the sense that he is constantly having to fight against the dominant white grain. He neither identifies as an Asian Australian poet or a writer of colour. And this idea of this hybrid sense of identity and this struggle to find your sense of self and sense of identity is something that's come through many of the poems that we've studied for this particular module. And for Yu, home is poetry. That's where he says that he feels at home, and home is the sense of word or sense of language. So he feels his sense of home or his sense of purpose perhaps when he is in that world of fiction and he is able to write and express how he's feeling. So New Accents was a poem that was published as part of his collection or anthology of poems called The Kingsbury Tales, which was published in 2008. Now, this title of this anthology serves as a pun for Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And the Kingsbury Tales follows the journey of a foreigner called O, who encounters people and experiences that make him more aware of himself as a migrant, and I guess that idea of the exile he felt within Australia. His poetry raises questions of what it means to be Australian and the challenges and assumptions that within Australia we are all welcome because we consider ourselves to be a multicultural society. So he challenges that assumption within his poetry. In fact, the persona within his poetry holds a deeply rooted bitterness, and that bitter tone is really evident within this poem, New Accents, influenced by his own experience, perhaps, of racism. Not only is he bitter towards Australia, but he's also critical of China and its pursuit for Westernness. The poem highlights the attitude towards the folly of having an accent that is not distinctly English sounding. So key ideas within this poem are the transnational identity, so the idea of having bicultural identities, and that hybridity, which is something that we've looked at before, the absurdity of translation and the English language itself, challenges of ideas of cultural acceptance for migrants. To be accepted into a culture, there are certain qualifications that an individual must have, regardless of the individual's identification or personal ethnicity, language or origin. So he's really questioning some of those ideas about culture and the link to identity. Propism is something that's also referenced within this poem. As we're going through the poem, you'll start to see some of the language that he's using and the mispronunciation that he refers to. And he mispronounces the word of English and pronounces it as anguish. Now, this is quite deliberate in terms of it really highlighting his anguish, I guess, and frustration in terms of the English language. This is particularly important for this poem as it is used to highlight the apparent ignorance of those with new accents, while also being used as a humorous effect. So in some places we might see it as sort of a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but it is quite layered, and it does really highlight Yu's frustration and bitter tone that he expresses in terms of his frustration with the English language, in particular pronunciation. There's a real sense of an oxymoron here in terms of that pronunciation of anguish, and he presents that within the phrase wonderful anguish. It is mispronounced, and the sense of anguish forms as an oxymoron or perhaps a paradox, which ironically draws the attention to the experiences of the migrants from non-English speaking backgrounds. In trying to speak this wonderful English dialect, they are left with the bitterness of realizing they can never attain perfect English pronunciation. They are labelled the fool by native speakers, perhaps, in Yu's eyes, and they are tried to fool around because they could not speak anguish. To speak English is anguish for speakers of non-English backgrounds. And we'll start to see that really come to life as we go through each of the stanzas within the poem. Now, this poem that Yu crafts is a traditional poem in structure in that it is 8 3-line stanzas. There is a strong sense of personal voice that is crafted through this first-person perspective, and it is has a deeply critical tone, which we will start to see as we go through this particular poem. So it starts off by saying, in Kingsbury in the late 1990s, the people I met constantly spoke English with new accents. P from Wooshie spoke of once travelling down a street in Melbourne. I'd never heard of that's called Nicholson Street. C from Canton talked about criminal cases as if they were criminal, and the best contribution he had made to English. Now, looking at these first 3 stanzas, we start to see that really light-hearted, tongue-in-cheek style language in the pronunciation there of Nicholson Street and also criminal, in the way in which he's really put that through phonetically in terms of the pronunciation that Asian Australians might have used at that time. The first stanza there really establishes a sense of setting for us within this poem, and that adjective of new accents, I think, really highlights that idea of the sense of newness in terms of place, which is seen as the otherness in terms of society. So that idea of new accents, new sense of place, new sense of belonging and sense of trying to struggle in terms of finding your identity. In that second stanza there, we've got the town or the city of Wuxi, which is a Chinese city near Shanghai. So we get a sense of where the characters or the personas from this poem are located. So we get the sense of that they are Chinese, and that again is further established within the third stanza there in terms of C from Canton, again another Chinese province. Looking at the next 3 set of stanzas, we start to really build in terms of our language, in terms of the way in which we can really deconstruct this poem. So it reads, language was when he said, when I first arrived in Australia, they tried to fool me around because I couldn't speak anguish. What a wonderful anguish that I've spent all these years labouring on, with myself, with my students. Some of them would say veggie table, others would accentuate the B in subble. And myself, unashamedly, once pronounced whore as whirl. So here we start to really get into that sense of the bitterness that perhaps he's feeling, in that he's laboured over this language for so long, and yet now that he's arrived in Australia, he's still not connecting to this place because he is so, I guess, so much considered the other in terms of his pronunciation. And I really like here how we've got that first stanza on this particular slide, how we've got some enjambment happening here. So we've got in that last line of that's the first stanza on the screen here, they tried to fool me around because I couldn't. And we go on to our next stanza, speak anguish. So even the idea that he's struggling to put together this sentence, that enjambment in terms of running our phrasing in our sentences across stanzas is really evident here. And again, as we've mentioned, that anguish, the connotation, the irony of feeling associated with being distressed. And the persona thus reflects on his own struggle to fit in and find a sense of acceptance due to his pronunciation. We've again got that paradox or that oxymoron in terms of what a wonderful anguish I've spent many years labouring on. So we've got the paradox there, which highlights his frustration, not only for himself, but also for his students in terms of when he was teaching English language and teaching other Chinese people to speak English. And I think that idea there of labouring on really highlights that ironic tone, which reveals his resilience and yet determination, but also a sense of near impossibility of assimilation due to these language barriers. So it's that particular stanza there is really rich in terms of highlighting his tone, his frustration, and his lack of being able to identify himself as being Australian. Looking at that next stanza there, Yu captures the humour of mispronunciation perhaps here in terms of the idea of vegetable or subtle, and even his own personal mispronunciation of whore, the way in which he's presented that. Yet I still feel that there's a real sense of an undercutting tone of harsh reality for new migrants in terms of their lack of ability to fit in. And within this stanza here, where we've got that little bit of tongue-in-cheek in terms of the mispronunciation, I think that that unpronounced dialogue gives a voice to the migrants who struggle to find a sense of place within Australia due to the prejudice that they may experience through their heavy accent of English that they've developed. Finally, looking at the last two stanzas, so we're looking here in terms of, again, Yu's personal frustration in that he lost his MA candidacy. So he lost his ability to study his Master of Arts, which obviously did create huge impacts for him personally. And then finally, in this last stanza, we're really sort of sensing that lack of certainty in place as he laments the prejudice which he has experienced through that bitter tone and his unwillingness to accept these consequences. And particularly in that last line, and my anguish. So that really highlights that bitter tone and that unwillingness there. And there is really an awareness that the mispronunciation can result into prejudice, alienation, and frustration. So really within this poem, we have a tone of frustration and cynicism as the persona describes various accents of many Chinese migrants in Australia during the 90s. He's rejecting the concept of assimilation as a token multiculturalism within Australia, and Yu's internal conflict and frustration is felt in this poem as he articulates the consequence of the migration through constant othering as a result of his new accents.